just a few housekeeping items real quick before we move in. And we're very happy that you're here with us today. I promise y'all that it was not my intention and it was not on purpose that this was scheduled the day after Election Day. We did schedule this probably in the first or second quarter of the year. So apologies for that, but thank you so much for being here regardless. We're really excited about this content and being able to bring this to you today. We are recording this webinar already. We want to be sure that this can be a resource that can be accessed later for those that were not able to make it, as well as just for you to be able to come back to at any point to use as a resource. We do plan to post this in different areas, and it's an important topic just to be able to know and just get a refresher occasionally and be able to use this. And we feel like this is an important topic to be a standalone webinar as well. So we thank you so much for being here. I do want to give real quick a content warning that this presentation is about serving victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, dating violence, and other forms of gender-based violence. So while today's slides do not contain explicit imagery or language, content does not need to be explicit to be triggering. So please, y'all, feel encouraged and welcome to take breaks if needed throughout this webinar. Okay, so today's agenda, what do we hope for to get across to y'all? We hope that by the end of this webinar, that you'll have a better understanding of the intersection between coordinated entry and safety planning, that you have better understanding of the importance of safety planning throughout the entirety of a participant's participation in a project. Available Texas Balanced State Continuum of Care resources that you can access and know are available. And then as well as being able to implement or feel more comfortable implementing safety planning in your housing services. Okay, so just to take a moment to introduce ourselves, my name is Billy Strew, and I am the COC Performance Manager at Texas Homeless Network, and I'm going to pass to my colleagues.
Yeah, thanks, Billy. Hi there, I'm Hope Rogers. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Systems Change here at Texas Homeless Network. I'm happy to be here today to make the connection back to coordinated entry and safety planning. And with that, I will.
Hi, y'all. I am Crystal Garcia, and I am the content coordinator at the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. And I live and work out of San Angelo, so it's really good to be connecting with people all over the state today. So,
thanks, Crystal and Hope. And also, Jim, do you want to introduce yourself real quick, just in case? I know Hope's internet connection is kind of choppy at times. And so, Jim, can you introduce yourself too, just in case we need you?
Yeah, I was not prepared to introduce myself, so I'm actually at my coffee machine. But Jim Ward, Director of Planning here at Texas Homeless Network. And just like the other folks have said, that we're really grateful to TASA to come share their expertise with the continuum. And so I'm just looking forward to the presentation and how we can continue to better serve survivors. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. All right, so just to begin with, I want to share we're really excited about being able to develop a partnership with Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. Y'all have seen webinars and partnerships that we have with Texas Council on Family Violence, but we're really excited about Crystal and her being able to come and share with us her expertise in this subject. Why a standalone webinar for safety planning? We do have our Serving Survivors series that does go into just policies and best practices to try to serve survivors, but this particular topic we feel like is really important to dig into. But just wanted to share this data with you. I'm not going to go into the details of the numbers. If that's something that you're interested in on data analysis, we're happy to share kind of how we came to these numbers and determine this. But what we found recently is is through HMIS data and housing inventory counts, we kind of saw that of all the survivors that we could identify within the continuum of care, needing housing and services from service providers within our continuum of care that enter data into HMIS, more than 25% of them are currently not being served. And that's a huge percentage. And there's lots of factors that we could determine that might be coming to that unmet need. But one thing that we can do through these webinars and having these discussions is to try to ensure as best as we can that our service delivery and our practices and our policies are not being a barrier that could keep survivors from getting access to the housing and services that they need. And so we want to ensure that these conversations are happening, that these trainings are happening, so that whether you are a victim service provider or a non-victim service provider, you can feel more comfortable and confident to be able to provide these safe and effective services to help survivors get to safe and stable housing. So with that, I'm going to pass to Hope. Here.
Yeah, thanks, Billy. Hopefully folks can hear me okay. I had to join by phone because I'm having some internet issues. So I will be participating exclusively by phone. I'm going to try to keep up with the chat as best I can, but it's hard to participate by phone and monitor the chat. So I will come back to the chat as often as I can. But I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the importance of safety planning in the court and entry process. And I'm going to be focusing on the next couple of slides more on broad concepts and principles related to court and entry and serving survivors, and won't be getting necessarily into the weeds of court and entry or the specific mechanics of the domestic violence workaround or specific HMIS considerations, because I think that's a bit too granular for today's presentation. However, if you participate in court and entry and do have specific questions about serving survivors in the local court and entry system, I would love to connect with you and would encourage you to reach out to the systems change team at ce@thn.org. I will put that in the chat after I deliver this content, so that our team can provide some tailored technical assistance to your agency or your region, given that this process can look a little bit different in each region, and each region has a different set of resources and needs, and it just requires some tailored planning and technical assistance. So with that, I assume that most folks in the room are at least somewhat familiar with court and entry, but if you're not, court and entry is a process where individuals and families experiencing homelessness, including Category 4 homelessness, can access resources within the local housing crisis response system, receive a standardized assessment for housing and supportive services, and then are referred and prioritized for those services and other mainstream benefits based on their needs as determined by the results of that streamlined assessment process. So as a best practice, local court and entry regions should, in theory, represent a diverse range of populations and voices in their local community, including both mainstream housing and supportive service providers, as well as victim service providers, or VSPs, as you'll probably hear us use that acronym frequently in this presentation. And VSPs are organizations that primarily serve survivors or victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, or persons that are fleeing or attempting to flee other dangerous or life-threatening situations that relate to violence experienced in their primary nighttime residence. So having a diverse range of those voices and experiences at the table when planning and carrying out local court and entry requirements allows regions and providers to better plan and understand and meet the needs of people experiencing homelessness in their local communities, as well as helps foster a streamlined pathway for services in a community-wide approach to quickly assisting folks who are experiencing housing crisis, regardless of why or how persons are presenting with a crisis. If we can move to the next slide, Billy. So the Texas Balance of State COC has identified 7 guiding principles of court and entry that are reflected on screen here. and are also documented in our coordinate entry written standards that are available publicly on our website. I'm not going to be going into detail about any of these principles in particular, but when we really think about what each of these principles means, and the way that they present in service delivery, I see a pretty direct connection between these principles and how coordinate entry providers can show up for survivors and persons affected by sexual assault, domestic violence, or other dangerous situations. So things like understanding and applying person-centered and trauma-informed care, a commitment to housing first and low barrier service delivery, a commitment to ongoing crisis resolution. All these things and principles really lay the groundwork for the way that we show up and engage with not only survivors, but all persons experiencing a housing crisis that are seeking services. We can move to the next slide. So the Texas Balance of State coordinate entry written standards outline the basic expectations for serving and engaging survivors in the coordinate entry process. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but reflects the kind of the most common and most frequently used best practices for serving survivors in coordinate entry, regardless of whether or not your organization primarily serves survivors or not. The spirit of coordinate entry and the great thing about coordinate entry is that coordinate entry really centers a no wrong door approach to services, meaning in theory, any person experiencing a housing crisis, regardless of why they're experiencing a housing crisis, can present at any coordinate entry point or front door agency and have their needs assessed and then receive referrals based on those needs. So for that reason, it's critical that all providers have an understanding and commitment to utilization of best practices when serving survivors. And some of those best practices include understanding and applying a trauma-informed approach to service delivery, the ability to understand and communicate information about local victim service providers and how someone can access those services, and then making warm referrals to those providers when possible to help foster that quick connection to those really critical services. And then continuously collaborating with your local victim service providers on a routine basis to coordinate care and services for mutual clients. In theory, this collaboration happens more frequently than just when you have a client presenting for needs. I see communities that are really successful with routinely collaborating with their victim service providers or doing it in a way where they are doing it routinely and not just when there's a need, and are strategically including their voices at the table when making decisions about their local community, about making policy changes, or when planning for a program or new funding source that comes into the community. So if your victim service providers are not at the table, I would encourage you to ask your community why, because it's really important that all providers have a voice at the table to meet the needs of a diverse range of folks experiencing homelessness in a local community. It's also really important to understand all of the purposes, processes, benefits, and risks to privacy and safety as it relates to coordinate entry and HMIS, and being able to relay that information to clients in a way that allows them to make an informed decision about their care and about the way that they move forward with services. So if you are not sure about your ability to communicate these considerations to a client, or just not confident in your ability to do so clearly, I would really encourage you to spend some time with our HMIS release of information form, our coordinate entry written standards, all of the documents that we have online that can help set you up for success to have these conversations. Spend some time understanding them and practice having these conversations with a coworker or a friend so that you can be better prepared to deliver this information to a client so that they can make an informed decision about their privacy and their safety and how to move forward with engaging with the housing crisis response system. And then lastly, but certainly not least, engaging in survivor-led safety planning conversations when needed is not only a best practice, but it's also an expectation of providers participating in coordinate entry. So I hope that folks leave here today with lots of great information about the kind of how and why of safety planning, but also lots of critical information about how trauma and experiences of assault can impact the way that folks engage with the local housing crisis response system and present for services, and that use that information to shape the way that you deliver services in your local community. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I want to take a minute and talk a little bit about why safety planning is so important in the court and entry process. So oftentimes when clients present for court and entry services, it may be their first and only time accessing services in a local community. And it's likely that it could be their first introduction to the housing crisis response system. And I feel like this is particularly true for survivors who have experienced assault or violence, and that violence results in housing instability or a feeling of no longer feeling safe in their home due to the proximity to their perpetrator, whether they live in the same home or not. So these are folks who may have never experienced housing instability or insecurity before, but who now have a sudden and very urgent need for housing services. And depending on the specific scenario, when a survivor shows up at your door for services, that may be the only time that survivor is able to safely access services and talk to a trusted provider. So how you use that time with that survivor is essential to their outcomes and the path, and their specific path towards stability and safety. And that initial engagement will set the tone for how that survivor engages with other services in the housing crisis response system, and with other services in general, whether that's at their primary care provider or another provider that they see. This is not just specific to the housing crisis response system, but all kind of helping professions. So your response and the way that you are showing up for survivors and believing survivors matters. I see this first engagement as really an opportunity to build trust with survivors and establish critical and tailored safety plans to help keep that survivor safe when they leave your office. Because again, this may be the only time that survivor has safety plan to plan for their safety and their immediate and long-term safety needs. We can move to the next slide. So before I pass it back over to Billy, I just wanted to take or share some strategies that can help set up court and entry assessors for success when engaging with clients for the first time through the court and entry process. I don't think any of these strategies are necessarily going to surprise you, but I feel like it's a good reminder to hear these things often, especially the more we get into this work. I think it's easy to lose sight of some of the kind of basic principles and where we started. So some of those strategies include ensuring that you're dedicating and scheduling an adequate amount of time for the court entry process to allow for a diverse range of responses and needs that are communicated by your client, such as a client disclosing that they've recently experienced assault or identifying themselves as a victim. I feel like the worst thing we can do is have a client disclose that have recently experienced assault or identify themselves as a victim, and then not give ourselves enough time to dedicate and spend with that client to plan next steps, hear their scenario, validate their experience. So it's really important that, in my opinion, that we focus on quality over quantity. And I think it's really easy if court and entry is your primary role to kind of get to a place where we look at the average experience as the only experience. And I think what I mean by that is, in my time as a court and entry assessor, I had many clients who could work through the process pretty quickly, start to finish, 20 to 30 minutes, doing the assessment, making those referrals, having a conversation about what the next steps might look like. And I think it can be really easy to kind of fall into a pattern of expecting every client to be able to fit into a 20 or 30-minute time slot, when in reality, when someone presents with having recently experienced assault or domestic violence. Those conversations may take more time to really thoughtfully plan and sit down and talk through what safety planning might look like. And so if we're always rushing to get the next client and overbooking ourselves, we are setting not only ourselves up for failure, but we're also setting up our clients for failure. So if there's one thing I can stress, it's to dedicate an adequate amount of time to the process and not minimize the experience of someone coming in and accessing services for the first time. Additionally, coordinate entry assessors should really take the time to understand the available resources in your community and get to know those providers personally, so that when a survivor presents for services, you already have an inventory of available resources in your community and are able to provide a tailored resource and referral based on those unique needs. Again, I want to stress the importance of providing warm referrals when possible. And what I mean by a warm referral, if you're not familiar, is, let's say I have a client who has disclosed that they are a victim or recently experienced assault. They would like a referral to a local victim service provider. A warm referral would be me opening up my email or hopping on the phone and calling that agency, giving some basic information about that client, letting them know that I'm referring them, and then providing any kind of critical information that's needed up front to help set that client up for success when they go to receive services at that agency. I think those warm referrals really go a long way, and I think clients are more likely to access those services when the provider on the other end knows they're coming and they're not just showing up or cold calling an agency or showing up at their front door and hoping to get services. I feel like clients are so much more likely to follow up when that pathway has been established by the provider through a warm referral. Additionally, understanding the client and provider power dynamics is really critical to serving not only survivors, but all clients. If this is a topic that you haven't explored, I would really encourage you to do so, because as providers and as helping professionals, we hold so much power compared to the clients that we're serving, just because of the relationship that we have to each other. And it's our responsibility to ensure that we are using that power appropriately to help guide our clients through what can be a really complicated process. In addition, I think it's also really important that we be honest with ourselves and routinely and regularly self-assess our own gaps in professional knowledge and advocate for ourselves to our supervisors and our agency to have those training needs met. I'm not necessarily saying that you need to go ask your supervisor to pay to send you to a conference or a specialized training, but maybe you two can work together to set aside an hour or two every week to read articles or watch videos on areas that you're less comfortable with or less familiar with to increase your knowledge and effectiveness as a provider. And last, but certainly not least, is, and I feel like I cannot stress this enough, is practicing routine self-care. The way that we take care of ourselves as service providers really shapes the way that we're able to show up for our clients. And I personally believe that we have a moral obligation as service providers to provide the best quality of care that we can. And that quality of care is going to quickly start to decline if you're not also prioritizing your own needs as a human and intentionally practicing self-care to cope with routine exposure to trauma and crisis that is a natural part of working in the housing crisis response system. If you are a supervisor or someone in a leadership position, I would really encourage you to assess how you are prioritizing self-care opportunities for your staff as well. And with that, I will pass it back to Billy. I know we'll have some time at the end for Q&A, but again, if there are any coordinate entry specific questions, would really encourage folks to reach out to ce@thn.org.
Excellent. Thanks, Hope. And just a couple more items real quick before we pass the baton over to Crystal. We want to just make a couple of connection points specific to continuum of care agencies as well as just homeless and housing providers. We see it as vitally important to practice safety planning throughout a participant's entire experience through a project, from intake to housing stability. And see that it's very important. We're not getting to the nitty-gritty of details yet of defining safety planning, all that, because I'm going to leave that to Crystal through a lot of her content. But safety planning is not just for intake and enrollment. It should be an ongoing process that is started at any point the participant is in the program. So that's even if you have a participant that enrolls and don't initially identify or disclose that they are fleeing or experiencing violence or are a survivor, but anything is subject to change. Circumstances are going to always change for your participants. And so there can be situations where it's important to be able to learn cues or learn if something is off, to be able to identify whether it's the right time to begin the process of safety planning for a particular participant and to be able to help them identify those needs. We recommend that you reassess a safety plan with a participant as often as you reassess their housing stability plan, that it should be in tandem and go together. And then also just to regularly assess whether to begin safety planning in the first place. If all of a sudden a participant is showing up with a new partner that is wanting to be involved and you can't get them to apart from the participant, or just certain signs like that where you just recognize, okay, something's going on here that I need to assess and address and begin safety planning. And so I think that it's important just to pay attention through the entire participation of a participant, that you are mindful and aware of when safety planning is needed. Want to mention the emergency transfer plan real quick, that it is important to include the emergency transfer plan within safety planning as well. Just a brief overview, and Jim, if you can drop the definition of emergency transfers into the chat. And then go into the definitions of it, but under the Violence Against Women Act, the COC and ESG funded housing providers, all covered housing providers must allow participants to request emergency transfers due to violence or the threat of violence. And COCs must develop an emergency transfer plan. It's critical for housing providers to include this in their project policies and their safety planning. And so it's important to know where to find the emergency transfer plan. We have it available on our websites, as well as within the written standards. And it's just important to know where that is and to have it within your policies as well as an agency, to regularly review it, to make it accessible to all of your participants. And we also want to make you aware that we are currently reviewing our emergency transfer plan and trying to gain people with lived expertise to provide feedback towards that. That is including updates to hopefully strengthen this policy from VAWA 2022. And we do plan in the future to provide emergency transfer plan refresher that can, again, kind of like this, be a standalone webinar to kind of bring everybody back on the same page with, as a COC, how we are addressing emergency transfers. We also want to let you know, Hope had mentioned about being aware of local VSP and being able to foster those relationships and collaboration. And so we want to let you know that we do have an interactive map. That's our Texas VSP directory. And this is based on the information from Texas Council on Family Violence's statewide directory. And so we just took that and we organized all of the VSPs according to continuums of care. We're planning just to do ours, but you know what? There's only 39 other counties that are not included within our continuum of care. So we just went ahead and did the entire state. So you can search this map by county. And so if you don't know who your most local victim service provider is, you can hopefully be able to look and search by your county and find out who your most local and what victim service provider is most near to you. Because if you're not a victim service provider, you can learn all these tools, but nothing can fully replace the lived expertise of the advocates working within the victim service providers. They can help assist you with this population. And so in the slide deck, which we will make available to you after this webinar, you'll be able to see the links here for our specific COC's emergency transfer plan, as well as HUD's model emergency transfer plan, the directory map that I just mentioned, as well as TCF, Texas Council on Family Violence's statewide directory. And then also with HOPE's content, our continuum of care's coordinated entry written standards. And you see here the email address you can reach out to. Any questions regarding coordinated entry, you can reach out to ce@thn.org, as Hope had mentioned. And then also any other additional general questions, you can certainly reach out to txboscoc@thn.org. So I want to pass the baton on. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm very excited to again introduce to you Crystal Garcia from Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. And she will share her slides, and yeah, baton to you,
All
Crystal.
right, here we go, y'all. So, I'm really, really excited and grateful to be talking about this specifically from the lens and from the context of sexual assault survivors. Sometimes survivors can often get lost. There's so many nuances. So even in talking about housing from a domestic violence standpoint, there are still nuances of survivors, sexual assault survivors specifically, that also need to be addressed. So I really like it when we come out and we actually like spend the time really, really looking specifically at sexual assault survivors, because lots of training sometimes can overmiss it. And I don't think it's a bad thing or like an intentional thing. It's just there's so much to learn. So I'm grateful for y'all again being here and grateful for this opportunity. So just a little bit about Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, or TASA. We are not CASA with the C. We get a lot of phone calls for them, but we are the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. We are the statewide advocacy organization that works to address and eliminate sexual violence. Our core areas of work are obviously in public policy, training like what we're doing today. And the great thing about us is most of our trainings we do offer for free. We have our own monthly webinar series. Those will start back up in 2025. We are on pause for November and December. But we do offer specific training, advocacy support, technical assistance, and those kinds of things to organizations directly. We can come out and train organizations specifically. There's a little bit of nuance and caveats to that, but we can offer those trainings to y'all. We do have paid training opportunities. However, most of the things are accessible for free training opportunities. We do prevention work. We specifically work with sexual assault programs who are actually working with young people. I love prevention work. Keeps me so hopeful. And then support programs who are directly serving survivors of sexual violence in various capacities. So our goal is to be that unifying voice. We do encourage people who are working with survivors in any capacity to join as members. You get access to a lot of training, you get access to a lot of things, but you also get access to the legislative work and being able to have an input on that as well. So feel free to reach out. Our website is tasa.org. We also have a second website specifically for our state conference. It's tasaconference.org. We do have a big statewide training coming up in May of next year, and we are currently accepting workshop proposals. So this is a topic that you are doing really well, or you feel like you want to put in a workshop proposal. We are trying to spread the word out for the entire state that we're taking proposals for the next month. Please feel free to reach out and participate in that if you want to. Just a little look at prevalence data, because this is information that we see survivors all the time. We might see them adjacently through getting services for other support needs, but we don't actually always know the real percentage of survivors. In Texas, overall, about 33% of our total population are survivors of sexual violence. That's a lot of people that are impacted by sexual violence. They may not be coming to your organizations directly for immediate care, within, the immediate aftermath of experiencing that trauma. But they are out living, working, playing, being a part of our community in every single day, and just every single day life. So sexual violence touches every aspect of our lives. And so it really matters that we understand that we have such a large prevalence of survivors, that we will come across survivors in the work that we do, no matter what facet of work that we do. So just breaking that down just a little bit further, 1 in 3 adult Texans, and then half of those survivors, that half of that 33% of that population, experience sexual violence more than once. This has a huge impact on the brain. I know this isn't a neurobiology training, but if you'd like to do neurobiology training, please feel free to reach out on that too, because understanding the neurobiology helps you understand the direct services that you're going to provide. But when we talk about survivors that have half of that population that have one or more, we're typically looking at survivors who have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, who have experienced at least 3 incidences of sexual violence, and that is going to impact how they participate in services. We have to be mindful that that could impact their memory, that could impact being able to just get to an appointment. So sometimes those survivors might be getting written off as complex cases, or people that don't care about getting help, or they're ungrateful for the services they receive because they can't even show up on time. Most of them have memory problems. Most of them have some other thing that they're dealing with. So we have to kind of redirect that framework of what's wrong with this person to what really happened to this person, at the neurobiological level. And then breaking that down further by gender, male survivors are often very overlooked and very, very forgotten in this process. So 1 in 5 Texas men are survivors of sexual violence, and 2 in 5 Texas females. I wish we had greater data, and really, strong data that really fully represents the LGBT community. But we know that survivors in the LGBT community and other marginalized communities in Texas are at greater risk to be targeted for sexual violence, because there is less services. It is harder at times for them to access culturally resonant services. So we still need to be mindful. While this slide only breaks it down by traditional binary genders, there are additional nuances that we as service providers can also be mindful about, and just make sure that we are also taking that knowledge just a little bit further. 90% of survivors do not report to law enforcement. And that, that's about 9% of people actually do. So really making sure that we don't have service processes that are tied to whether or not somebody reported, because most people don't. And so for a survivor, when we're doing an intake with them and we ask them about their history of violence, and our second question is, was this reported to law enforcement? They may feel like you don't believe them. They may feel like what happened to them was not necessarily real or valid because it wasn't deemed a crime in the criminal justice system. However, now that we know, most people don't. Like, they are not alone, and there are lots of reasons, and there are lots of barriers to reporting, and there are lots of things that motivate survivors to maintain their privacy or not want to get involved with the criminal justice system. Even though we are working to strengthen that, we are working to make it easier for survivors to report and go through the criminal justice system. Only about 1% of cases are actually convicted. So it's a very difficult process to go through, and many survivors have many, many reasons, and all of those reasons are valid, right? They're all valid because the survivor knows what is best for them in that situation. And for many of them, it is not following through with reporting. And then only about 7% of survivors seek medical care. And I like to talk about that when I like to talk about planning too, because safety, and that sense of safety, is also their health needs. And so there may be additional support services that survivors may need to utilize to get, testing and things like that, even if they don't get a forensic exam and get the care for what they need medically, because most survivors do not see a doctor even when they need to. Survivors are twice as likely to have physical, mental, emotional problems that have an overall impact, and it decreases their quality of life. And this is a quality of life in all areas. So we do need to be mindful of that. We do need to be mindful of having additional screenings, additional protocols in place to keep a survivor from moving further into a crisis that could result in self-harm, that could result in a relapse, it could result in a new incidence of substance abuse and things like that. So it's all put together, right? We need to look at the survivor as a whole person and consider all of their needs whenever we're working with them, and really utilize those relationships. It may not be something that's within my scope of practice, but I know somebody who knows somebody, right? And we can get you help in multiple ways, and we can support you in multiple ways, because there's no wrong way or right way to be a survivor. Another thing, and I'm not going to spend too long on this data, but this is something that just overwhelms me every single time, is just the relationship between the survivor and the offender. And these are Texas specific data sets. We collect these every year. Law enforcement agencies do report in to DPS, and so we do have real-time numbers on this, and we can keep up with them. But just the overwhelming number of survivors that know and trust the person that caused them harm. It does not look like what we see on TV. It's not a Lifetime movie where somebody's jumping out and getting you while you're loading groceries in the car. I am a big horror fan, so I've seen every horror movie ever. There really isn't going to be someone under the car with a knife to get your Achilles tendon, like The Hitchhiker scared me when I was probably in the 4th grade. It really is more likely to be someone you know and you love and you trust. And so just on here, the blue categories represent romantic relationships or intimate relationships between people, but the orange represents acquaintance relationships. So this could be a coworker, this could be a friend, this could be a dorm mate, this could be anybody, really. And so whenever we're looking at housing services, this becomes really, really important. We're going to talk about this a lot going forward, is that services need to be, and we need to consider how we plan for services with such that deep betrayal of, this was somebody I loved, this was somebody I cared about, this might be somebody I want in my life again, and as a survivor I just might want the violence to stop. And that can sometimes tear at us from an ethical standpoint. We might hear service providers saying things like, if that ever happened to me, I'd be doing this, I'd be doing that. It becomes like the whole court of public opinion. Especially like social media and stuff like that. It's just leave him, just leave him, just leave him, just do this, just do this, just do this. And it can be very hard for us to respect a survivor's wishes and desires, even if they're different from what we think we would do in that situation. Being able to consider that trauma bonding, and that again, I talk about the brain a lot, that neurobiological chemical connection that we have with people that we love and we trust, and to be harmed in that way, to rebuild trust again. Sometimes survivors are not trusting of helping professionals, and that is okay. That is not necessarily personal. That is not necessarily against us. That is part of the trauma, because survivors are most likely to be harmed by people that care about them, people that have told them great and wonderful things about themselves while simultaneously harming them in the worst ways imaginable. So, and this is a really small chart. It's really, really difficult to see, but I just wanted y'all to get just a visual idea of where sexual assault happens. Again, this kind of helps us expand our lifetime knowledge, lifetime movie knowledge of sexual violence, and then the actual occurrences that are actually happening in Texas. And we actually know where people feel the most safe and the most threatened at the same time. So as you can see very, very easily, a residence or a home is where a person is overwhelmingly most likely to be sexually assaulted, right? These are the categories that they they collect at DPS. You may hear other stories, other things like that. This isn't necessarily a case for or against any kind of prevention programming, like putting lights, on streets and alleys and sidewalks and stuff like that. But it just gives us a really data informed idea to plan around at the policy level, at the agency level, even helping us be informed when we're participating in coalition work and things like that, to know what to say and how to say it and really advocate for survivors at a systemic level, as we understand this also happens in a place that I also trust, right? And it makes a case for housing situations, because when you've been harmed in the places that are most familiar and the most trusting for you, you may need to go somewhere else, all right? And this makes that case for those survivors. And we can do that with data, and really, really be informed and not buy into some of the more myths and more of the conspiracy theories of where sexual assault is actually happening. So, sexual assault can create immediate housing needs in the aftermath of sexual assault, and then it can also create housing needs throughout the lifespan. So we're going to spend some time talking about both, and we're going to spend some time talking about why. But I want to preface that with some really important information about how often survivors are screened in housing programs for sexual violence. So, in an NSVRC study in 2020, so this is a really recent study, over 70% of homeless women were not asked by their shelter staff if they had ever experienced a violent victimization. So this kind of grouped domestic violence and sexual violence together. Again, I know this is gendered, and I did speak earlier about male survivors. So if women who are 2 in 5 survivors in Texas are not being asked about their history of sexual violence, what is also happening to men, right? Because providers are actually more likely to ask a female identified survivor, a person that uses she, her pronouns, if they were sexually assaulted. They're a little more comfortable asking that question, which means male survivors are not being asked at all. And that is definitely an area of practice that we definitely need to get better at, and making sure that male survivors are seen in this process as well, because it still has an impact on someone's brain, someone's functioning, right? So a reason a survivor might want to access housing services, unstable housing or being underhoused, and homelessness also increase the risk for violence itself. Those areas are often not safe. They can be areas where trafficking is normalized, even though we as helping professionals know it's absolutely not wrong. In those kinds of situations, getting through just to day, just getting to eat, getting to have, those basic human dignity things of a shower and a warm, comfortable couch to sleep on, puts that survivor at risk to be exploited, to experience sexual coercion, in the age of digital, trading like OnlyFans and things like that, being put in situations where their body becomes a commodity, is a form of violence. So if you have somebody who's a survivor who is now facing homelessness or getting an OnlyFans account and having an abusive partner run that, they are really faced with a lot of really, really terrible choices. How do you regulate your nervous system when I'm back in a situation that's also putting me at risk for sexual coercion or sexual violence, right? How do you actually make choices about how to survive for that day? Survivors are more likely to face threats or harm in the home. So also, again, how do you make those decisions, right? And even if the survivor was harmed by someone that may have necessarily been an acquaintance, but they may also still not have a supportive living environment at home, right? And how do you choose between the lesser of the two? Survivors may not feel safe at home, even if the assault did not happen in the residence. Now, I showed y'all the crime data that it is more likely to happen in the residence, but I may still not want to be in my home situation. Maybe the survivor was sexually assaulted in the dorms, let's say the example of 3 floors down, right? but the person who assaulted me still knows how to get a hold of me. I still have to pass them every day when I go to eat, when I go down to class in the elevator every single day. They still could potentially come back and cause further harm through threats, through harassment, through sexual violence again, right? So there's lots of nuances that we need to consider about the home. And again, it's about the regulation of the nervous system. So we just go back to that Maslow's basic hierarchy of needs. I need to be warm and I need to feel safe. My brain cannot feel safe if that threat of violence continues. Even though we know trauma dysregulates that brain functioning, it still does not make sense, right? It still does not make sense that so many people that can cause harm can so easily access a survivor. And we just need to believe that, right? We don't need to tell them it's okay, you're going to be safe, get a Ring camera, do this, do that. Like sometimes survivors just don't want those solutions. They want to be believed. They want to access the services in a way that makes sense for them. And then they don't want necessarily the rest of the advice after. Even though from us, we're coming from a really good place of love and caring and wanting to actually help them. Trying to calm that nervous system isn't always necessarily going to actually make a survivor feel seen and valued in that helping relationship. Survivors might need a safe place just to process, just for a couple days, just a quiet place to go and to actually make decisions, right? There might be noise, there might be roommates, there might be, cousins or young people in that situation. Maybe the person is a single mom going through a divorce and they don't want their children watching them go through and they need a place to scream or cry or just, fall apart for a second. They might not necessarily want parents or friends or family being able to see that. It might just feel good. It might just feel good to have a quiet space. I love my time by the lake, so it makes sense to me that a survivor might need 1 or 2 nights just to process, right? Just short-term housing support. And then there are also lots of power dynamics to consider. And the way that this particular slide words it, I really like how it's worded, of the power dynamics of having a landlord and non-home ownership. So there are lots of different ways that we can access services where people can make decisions about our living and actually hold power to whether or not we can come back and sleep in that place the next day, right? There's I could be evicted, I could have a landlord, I could have a landlord that's also sexually harming me, right? I could have someone in that house that can very easily exploit me, but I still need a place to sleep the next day, right? So if I don't have something that belongs to me, or maybe I can't make that payment to the bank and I could easily risk foreclosure, and most people do not fully own a place where they can absolutely stay, right? Like even if I buy something and I finance it for 20 years, I'm still beholden to someone that has some kind of power over me. And it's still scary, right? It's still scary. And that's very difficult on a survivor, just knowing I'm responsible for this, or I have to do this, and I have to make this payment, and I have to do this. And maybe I'm a small business owner and I need to take a week off to take care of myself because I'm having, really bad trauma triggers right now. I'm not sleeping at night because I'm having flashbacks. But if I'm a small business owner and I don't work that day, I didn't earn any money, right? So it's just very, very complex, right? And we don't always make a lot of space for survivors to actually practice any kind of self-care, or rest, So, and then there's long-term economic impact from past trauma. So there's lots of great research done by the University of Texas, on how survivors actually earn a little bit less, the cost of getting treatment, the cost of long-term therapy. Maybe they don't qualify for something like crime victims compensation because you do have to report to even be eligible, and then you have to actually be approved. And then if I don't want to report, then I'm no longer eligible for that program. So I might have to take all of my savings to actually pour in and get a different place to stay. Again, the example I gave as a small business owner, I'm not sleeping, I'm not working, I'm not earning, right? And so I'm dipping into my savings, and I can very quickly and very easily become 1 or 2 paychecks away from being in a situation where I'm facing homelessness, right? Where I can go from having a full bank account, a full refrigerator to just not, right? And then the memory issues, right? The long-term memory issues of I have to pay this bill or I have to pay this rent, so I have a late fee or 3 days and they're knocking on your door with that you need to pay this now, and you're like, oh, I've overspent my budget. Now I need to scramble and find that money. And then the actual neurobiological impact of the trauma itself, right? Like I said, there's lots of reasons. There's memory things, there's flashback things, there's nightmare things. All of that plays a part in how we access housing, or maybe how we take care of that home situation, whether or not we can comply with some of the rules of certain housing programs or be at a certain place at a certain time. So there are actual like impacts from that can stay with the survivor lifelong. And just being mindful and just being considerate of that survivor, and it's just not easy, right? It's not easy for them at times. Now, being a survivor isn't necessarily also not going to be bad for the rest of their life. I also want to acknowledge survivors have strengths, and they're incredibly, incredibly resilient people. We just got to find really creative workarounds to, get around that real impact. And then once we do that, it actually allows the brain to recover and get better. So here are some questions that I want us to just kind of consider and answer. If we were doing this in person, we would actually split into groups and we would actually have a group discussion on this, but we're not going to be able to do that through the power of a webinar, but I still want us to be able to actually answer these questions. So when I am planning for services, direct services for a survivor, I need to be able to think through what is the extent and range of a survivor's housing needs, right? I need to know enough about sexual violence to even be able to answer this question. And then I need to do it within my organization or my day-to-day practice. What would it look like if we were to design a specific safe housing or a shelter or a space or an assistance program or a subsidy for a survivor of sexual assault? Like, we often jump to solutions and we don't actually sit down and think, what does that really look like in practice? In reality, in the day-to-day, what do survivors actually need from these services, right? And if we can ask a survivor, that's great. We can ask them better. And then how can we link the sexual assault advocacy community and housing communities, again, over and over, creating those partnerships. But it's hard if we're doing day-to-day services and we all of a sudden at 2 o'clock in the morning have a housing crisis. That's not the time for us to be meeting. So make time, go to coffee with your advocate. We like to talk about things that are not sexual assault related. We want to know what's our favorite animal, what's our favorite movie. We want to talk to you about other things that are going on with us. It's good for us too. And if we can just sit down and, have lunch and get to know them or something like that, and just really create those actual relationships when there's an emergency at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's a lot easier for us to actually be able to work together and actually be able to truly collaborate, because we have deeper relationships with each other than just, I saw you at that one coalition meeting where everybody passes out their brochures and we go around in a big circle and we say, hi, my name is, and I work for such and such organization, and we give our 30-second service commercial, right? We've all been to those meetings. We all love them. They might have lunch attached to them, but we don't really get to know other service providers in those situations. And then as we answer these questions, this pushes us into the safety planning process. So we're usually going to start in that direct service process. And then whenever we've answered these questions, it actually strengthens our ability to see the survivor safety needs with them, while allowing them to also have the autonomy to be the authority on what's best for them. So we really want to focus on these 4 main components when we are actually safety planning with a client. And what does that actually mean to achieve safety for a survivor of sexual assault? So first thing is definitely the safety itself and defining what safety actually means for a survivor. What safety actually means is a regulated nervous system, which sounds really weird because you're like, the brain, what? Like, I always thought safety was whether or not the chair was going to break or the right signs on the road or anything like that. All of those sense of safety, knowing that something is clean, knowing that something is accessible, knowing that it's going to work for you, impacts the nervous system. So when we set up protocols, when we put in a ramp for somebody to be able to see, when we have our 711 relationship where we get translation for deaf and people that are deaf and hard of hearing, that impacts the nervous system. We don't just do those things because they're best practices and they're ethically the right thing to do. We do those things because it sets the survivor up for success. The feeling of safety comes from the brain. So we get those things in place so that survivor walks in and says, hey, I'm gonna be okay here. I can trust this, right? I can trust this. And it might be hard, and I might have to do some mental work to trust it, but I am establishing that process with that survivor. The next part is our role with advocacy. Advocacy in direct services, and then advocacy again at the systemic level, documentation. So the safety plans originally came from the mental health field, most often used in psychiatric facilities where people were experiencing maybe suicidal ideation and wanting to die by suicide. And we actually went through and we did some kind of a contract with them that said, these are all the ways that I'm going to make it through the weekend. These are all the ways I'm going to make it through the night. And then helping professionals expanded from there. And it really worked well for DV and SA services of how are we going to keep you safe for the night? How are we going to keep you safe for the week? So we look at documentation. We actually look at the form. Some people have a formal form. Some people don't. Again, some people need the formal form. Some people don't, but it's really important that we document this process and we do it in an ethical way. So we don't necessarily need to document voyeuristic details about what happened to that survivor. We don't need to necessarily go down the rabbit hole and watch that through a dramatic lens. We just need to know the information to make things work. And then the last part is the support that we provide, making sure that we are looking at that from immediate success, right? I'm giving you a solution that gives you immediate sense and an immediate sense of safety, and then long-term sense of safety. So a really great example of this is we have a wonderful, amazing program. It was a joint effort between TASA and the Texas Council on Family Violence to make sure that if I experience domestic or sexual violence in my home, and I'm beholden to a landlord, that I can break that lease without consequences, right? It's great, wonderful. I love that program. I talk about it often. Many people will promote this as a solution for survivors. The critical downfall is, yes, I can break this lease, but this is not going to cover a deposit for my new place, right? And so being able to see that survivor for that full continuum of care, I can offer you this as a solution. It's great. It's amazing. It is wonderful. It is empowering for survivors. But I also don't need to set you up on the back end to fail because this does not guarantee you a new housing situation. And I need to be fair and balanced and realistic about that solution with that survivor. So that is providing support to provide them with the transparent information that we can have wonderful, powerful programs that exist for survivors that also have loopholes on other housing needs that they may also need to consider when I am providing them for support, right? And it's really just being informed about how those things work. So the advocate does play an important role. Many times we can and do need to reach out to a victim advocate to help us in the safety planning process. And then many times we do need to be mindful to determine whether or not someone has another mental health threat going on to them. And then there are many survivors who do not want to utilize the 911 process. They don't want to send, in some areas, in some counties, sending out law enforcement to assess someone that might be in a mental health crisis after we've called 911, it might not be the best solution for them, right? So we also need to be mindful and we need to train on additional options. But if there is an immediate danger, we do need to utilize at times a 911 process, but knowing when and where and how. And sometimes that may not necessarily be the first call we make, but knowing that there are moments when that call may have to be made. And then we take every other step to not have to necessarily make that call. And then our role in assisting the victim in creating the safety plan. First and foremost, the ethical side of it. Survivors may not do the things that we want them to do. Survivors may not want to participate in the way that we would participate if we were the survivor ourselves. So again, leading them through that, recognizing sometimes survivors may be confused, may be impacted by that trauma, and may need additional support, but not overwhelming them with too many options. So the components of the plan itself, again, like I said, there's lots of different ways that people do this, but we really want to look at the residential and housing safety. If they're not going to necessarily leave their housing situation, what does that residence look like? What does access look like? Who's there? Who are safe people around you? The security of that environment. If I am going to a different situation, I also want to make sure that that person's going to be safe there. So for example, I have had to recommend survivors who don't have a vehicle to maybe a shelter or a temporary living situation, and they don't feel safe there, or I can't go back to this place because another resident at the shelter may have already committed some kind of harm against me, right? And I may have been kicked out because I punched somebody in the face, right? I worked with clients on probation for a long time. Fighting for them as a trauma response was not an uncommon behavior. So, hitting someone, that was an option for them, right? And I get that from a trauma standpoint as a survivor myself. I'm a well-qualified, well-educated professional. I could hit somebody someday. I hope that never happens. I hope I keep my brain up to date, but I get it. Like, I get it when a survivor might tell me, I've been kicked out for fighting. That's a trauma response, right? And I may have to make some inroads to get them back into some good graces, but I can't necessarily guarantee that fighting as a trauma response won't happen again, right? And then I want to look at workplace security. Again, maybe the harm is going on in that workplace, but also people know where people work. People can find people at work. I want to make sure that in that housing situation, that workplace security doesn't play a secondary factor in them not being able to participate in a housing option, right? Escape plans, how to get out of those situations. If this doesn't work, if the trauma is so overwhelming, I can't participate in this program or thing. How can I get out of it, right? If someone who has caused me harm is coming back into my housing situation, how can I get out of it? And we think about that as just violent, intrusive, again, like what we see in the movies, but somebody could come back with love, gaslighting and love bombing and all those things of a really sweet, let's get back together, I'm sorry, coercive, narcissistic manipulation that doesn't even look dangerous to the outside eye, right? So we kind of work with them as, again, like I said, survivors often have really trusting relationships with people that caused them harm, and sometimes they want them back in their life. They just want the abuse to stop. So we can still work with them in those areas too. Sometimes there are needs to work with law enforcement. Again, some people may not want to participate in working with law enforcement, so we kind of let the survivor drive that particular process of whether or not they want to involve law enforcement. But we do know it's an option, right? And then important phone numbers. For a long time, this was because we needed to make payphones. And I actually came into the advocacy world 20 something years ago when we actually taught survivors how to utilize and how to keep extra money for payphones. We don't necessarily do that now. The reason that we want to learn or have important phone numbers documented somewhere else is because phones can often be broken in violence and conflict, including a sexual assault. Somebody might take your phone, somebody might smash your phone because they don't necessarily want evidence of maybe what happened to you or where you were, or they just don't want you to be able to access other people. Some other considerations, I want to know whether or not somebody has access to a firearm. Firearms are often used against the survivor, and we want to know within a safety plan whether or not firearms are present, right? That helps the survivor know, doesn't necessarily always give the survivor a sense of safety. It could be something if they end up in a mental health crisis that they could use to harm themselves or that somebody else could use to harm them. So that is something that we do want to ask. We want to ask about medications. We want to ask about anything that could potentially cause harm to a survivor from themselves because they might not necessarily be in the best of mental health at that moment. And they need that critical support from us, or someone is harming them, and those things can be used to continue to harm them as well. So safety sacks. And again, I know we're in a digital era, but I still talk about safety sacks because a lot of times we have brochures and pamphlets and things that we want to give survivors all the things. Sometimes having brochures and pamphlets and cards can put that survivor in further risk. So if we are talking about someone that is going to go back and live, even temporarily with someone that has harmed them, this can trigger more violence against them. So we do want to keep that plan confidential, but have access to that. Lots of creative ways. Lots of organizations might make plans that actually fit in your shoe or your purse or something like that. So cell phone and charger, everything is on cell phones now. Everything. And like I said, that's the reason that a lot of times they're taken or broken when somebody is causing harm to them, because everything is on our cell phone. So we do need some backups, maybe a flashlight, maybe that's in the car, if I need to get out of a situation, and then documentation for the survivor itself of what's going on, if there's additional harm that's occurring to them. And maybe they're in a safe housing situation where they don't have to think about additional harm, and maybe they're just making a transition. They've been there for 60 days or 90 days and need to move forward. These are some other things that we can give them. Again, safety planning does not happen once, right? This might be safety planning as I'm transitioning out of a different kind of housing situation. Notebooks and pens, again, because everything is on our phone, and sometimes we do need things written down. Because if that phone is broken, I might need to be able to get back into that website or need to get that stuff. Again, also being mindful that this could be compromised. Pen and paper can be compromised, but the reality of digital world and how easily we can lose access to digital services, internet can be cut off, internet might not work, those things. So we do need backups, and we do need to kind of balance that out. And then the information about who's working with them, what resources. There are so many resources, and often all of them have an entry point. We might need to see an intake person here, but I also need to see this person to get the bus passes I need. I also need to see this person at the workforce center. So those wraparound services that we envision, where it's one intake, one program, one time of telling your story, one point of contact. We're working there. We're trying to not have the survivor have to do so much paperwork, so many different people that they have to meet and know. We're not there yet, right? And so there do need to be a way that safety planning also allows them to not have to force their memory so hard. They're already working really, really hard to remember a lot of details, right? Books, websites, and resources, that may become later in the process. That may not be in the immediate. We might not necessarily need all these things, but what we need to be able to do is assess that survivor in the here and now. What do they need in this moment for both short-term and long-term success? And that will change with each and every survivor. Each and every survivor has strengths, and they are unique, and we need to play up each and every one of those. So our behavior changes because we are in the position of power. We are in the position of good mental health at that moment. We are in the position of informed professionals. So our behavior changes to meet their needs. Their behavior doesn't necessarily need to change to meet our policies and practices and ways of doing. All right. Advocacy and referral. Connecting clients to additional straight victim services, support services. And again, that might not necessarily be in our scope of practice. We can know a little bit about those things, and then we can call the advocate in to help them. Another best practice that I'm seeing a lot of organizations doing in their community is having a space for the advocate to meet with that client at that organization. It's not necessarily going to mean adding a victim advocate to your wheelhouse. It's this victim advocacy organization meets. They already have the staff. They already have the people that they're wanting to serve. Rather than adding a victim advocate to our program, it's very difficult to start a new sexual assault program in Texas. On Tuesday mornings, the advocate comes to meet our people. and they have a private confidential space where they can meet and discuss service needs. Right? Rather than I have to get you a bus pass, I have to do this, I have to have the van transport you to their office. The advocate can come to the client, right? And it makes sense. A lot of organizations are partnering with that. I've seen that in substance abuse treatment. I've seen that in for people who are incarcerated that need additional victim services, where the advocate can actually come out and meet them, or maybe the advocate just comes and hangs out, on maybe the lunch distribution during the sandwich lunch program. I know our local victim advocacy does that with the soup kitchen on Tuesdays. It's bologna sandwich day, and Open Arms is there to kind of hang out. And they may not necessarily even be tabling or providing resources. They're connecting with people just on that human to human. I want to know you. I want to know about your life. If and when you need me, I'm here, right? I'm a resource for you. And I know you, you're not just a number or a grant thing that I have to meet in terms of service provision. So, meeting the needs of survivors, we want to prioritize the sexual assault. We want to prioritize how instability can quickly become a crisis for a sexual assault survivor, no matter how long ago the assault happened, who perpetrated it, and where the violence occurred, right? We don't necessarily need any of those details. In this case, for this particular situation, when it comes to housing, survivors are survivors are survivors. Yes, they're unique. Yes, they are different, but it does not matter how they identify as a survivor. It's just that they do, because the impact on the brain is still the same. And then when we're developing policy responses, so I'm going to wrap up this presentation with information about how to overhaul at the policy level. So we talked about how to overhaul at the direct service level. We need policies that can support us being able to make those direct services changes. So that's at the more operational level. For survivors, an effective response includes survivors. So you'll see that at the top of this pyramid, that an effective response is survivor driven. Is there a way for survivors to give feedback? Is there a survivor advisory board that can tell you, this does or does not work for me as a survivor? We want those changes to be timely, accessible, and then we really want to focus on our training and our programming needs, right? Assessing, reassessing over and over and over again, who benefits from this, who benefits differently from this, and who doesn't benefit at all, and what changes do we need to make, and making those efforts coordinated and comprehensive, with the input of maybe other professionals and then survivors with that lived experience. And then one of the things that I will provide you with is a toolkit from the National Sexual Assault Coalition. There's the resource sharing project where they have so many resources on housing, but this particular toolkit is actually for OVW grantees that are working with survivors in transitional housing. And these are the best practices, and these really mirror and these really match the practices we talked about in the beginning of how we review those policies. First thing that we want to look at is eligibility criteria. And making sure that survivors can actually meet the eligibility criteria. And then we want to create the system for understanding our capacity to respond to survivors. So often we'll hear, yes, survivors need services. Yes, survivors are not being asked. I'm going to start tomorrow asking all my clients about whether or not they're survivors of sexual violence. Do I know what I'm going to do when they respond yes? Do I need some more training? Do I need some more time before I implement this practice? But that's stuff that we actually need to look at. What is my real capacity here? This does not give us a pass. This doesn't mean we don't get to implement these critical changes. It just means some of them are slow, right? Because we want to do best for survivors. We don't want to cause harm by implementing a half thought out or an impulsive response to survivors' needs. So take the time to evaluate your capacity to actually respond as a professional, as an organization. What partnerships do we need? And really lay a strong groundwork before you start making these changes. Make them, but a good solid groundwork needs to happen first. Survivor-led services that are voluntary and confidential, where the survivor is recognized as having autonomy, where the process of consent is really managed and really, really demonstrated in a really transparent way to that survivor. Because what happened to them specifically when we're talking about sexual assault survivors, a violation of consent is what caused them harm, right? Is what humiliated them, is where somebody exerted power and control, is taking away their ability to say yes, no, or maybe, right? When we as helping professionals restore that, we restore even more than just giving them access to housing. Programs that are culturally specific, culturally appropriate, and there's lots and lots of reasons that we need to adapt those, but we want to make sure that it's one thing to walk into the door. It's another for when I walk into the door that's meaningful and important to me. The active listening skills are really, really important here. Cross-training on motivational interviewing, cross-training on mental health CPR, and making sure that we can really, truly listen to survivors, because sometimes it's really hard not to just jump in and start offering brochures and solutions and just slow down and listen. And then engaging in individual and systems advocacy. A housing first approach. This really, really matters for survivors. Again, I've been doing this for 20 something years. Many times have I seen organizations that have a practice of deal with your trauma first, then we'll get you sober. How am I going to do that? Right? My nervous system's not regulated. I can't sleep without flashbacks. Of course, I'm abusing a substance and misusing a substance to do that, right? So we really want to look at we don't necessarily look at whether or not you're an active addiction and need treatment or doing this or doing that. Housing is first because that's what stabilizes people. I need a place to sleep. I need a place to rest. I need a place to feel like I belong and won't be harmed. And then all the rest can fall into place from there. Participate in economic justice advocacy. Economic justice benefits us all, benefits all survivors and other people in need of housing services. The holistic healing framework, looking at that healing is possible, healing happens, not necessarily going to have to live with the devastating impacts of post-traumatic stress for the rest of your life, and being a survivor does not necessarily have to lead at the core of a survivor's identity. Again, trauma-informed responses through trauma-informed care lens. There are tons of trauma-informed care trainings that are, you can go 6 hours, you can go 4 hours, and just seeking those out and actually truly getting real trauma-informed training. And then continuing ongoing assessment for the safety of the survivor, for the policies that best work for that survivor, and your practices in your organization. So, all right. Advocates are critical. Victim advocates, sexual assault victim advocates are a unique place, and they are actually legislatively identified and protected. They have a little bit of a different training. They do go through very specialized training. This doesn't mean you can't help and serve survivors. But tap an advocate, like call us in, tag us, because we want to help. We want to be there. As you can see here, again, this is more research from the University of Texas, their Institute on Domestic and Sexual Violence. Most people do not know that a rape crisis center or what a sexual assault program is and how to access it in their community. So we really want to learn what those programs do. They provide the crisis support, medical and legal accompaniment. Again, only a designated sexual assault program advocate can provide some of these critical services. So I've seen many, many wonderful helping professionals that's like, I'll go in the hospital room with them. I really want my person to get a sexual assault exam. They trust me. I've been working with them for a long time. I am happy to go in there and hold their hand. That actually becomes a legal issue. We do want the correct professional in there so that the other helping professionals can't be called into court. And there's actually a whole legal process within victims' rights. So want to make sure that we're not actually inadvertently crossing boundaries through the name of helping. Because again, like I said, it's not a malicious intent. It's just because most people just don't know these particular protections exist for survivors, and they're well-meaning and well-intentioned. And so I also included a link to find TASA's Crisis Center locator. We have about 88 sexual assault programs in Texas. Most of those programs are dual services. They offer services to both sexual assault survivors and domestic violence survivors. A lot of them have shelter services and things like that. However, there are still a small number of standalone programs in Texas that only serve sexual assault survivors, and there's a very small number of DV programs in Texas that will inadvertently, again, not through malicious intent, turn sexual assault survivors away because they only serve sexual assault within the context of intimate partner violence. So TASA does have a crisis center locator where we've identified our standalone programs and things like that. So survivors themselves can get access to this and helping professionals get access to, especially the designated sexual assault programs in Texas. So they can make sure that we're not just working with a program that's trained to serve survivors, but they are also recognized through the Office of the Attorney General to be able to provide the medical and legal accompaniment as well. So again, like I said, it's not a malicious intent when a survivor is turned away. It becomes a funding thing. It becomes a scope of practice thing. And we, just as helping professionals, want to do the right thing and know fully and wholly that there may be a support, there may be a shelter at this organization, but can that survivor actually utilize it? And that's just getting to know the program, right? It's just getting to know the program in the area. Here's what I also know about providers and helping professionals. We will find a way, right? And if a shelter has to turn somebody down, it is just as hard on them as it is on the survivor because they will. I have rarely seen it happen because they're going to find a way. Like, can I, in some way, somehow, make this puzzle piece fit together so that I don't have to serve the survivor down? So when a lot of times when I tell people that there are some rare cases where a survivor may be turned away, I also know it is because they've tried everything they can to make it work. And it comes down to something outside of the person and the organization that limits them in their scope of practice, but they're going to find a solution no matter what, right? And we know those things up hand. It's a lot easier for it to get that right referral rather than trying to do it at 3 o'clock in the morning. So all right, like I said, I did include the resources. These are the actual toolkits and stuff I used to teach from today. They get really in-depth in resources. The Transitional Housing Toolkit is amazing, but also one of the things I wanted to point out in there, not only is this a link to that document itself, which is about 10 pages long with the best practices and stuff that I reviewed for y'all, each of those have additional training links in there that give you even more information than what I was able to get through today and then what they were actually able to capture within the toolkit. So very comprehensive. This was just updated. So it's brand new, just on the market, and it's really digitally informed and digitally friendly because that's what we're doing these days. And so all the links work, and there's additional trainings, there's podcasts, there's other ways of learning if you're not just a print out and read a manual type person, infographics and stuff like that. So lots of different ways to learn best practices for helping survivors. And then lastly, TASA does provide a resource guide for survivors that organizations can pass out. We typically use it for hospital accompaniment. That guidebook is available in both Spanish and English. TASA is very committed to language justice, so we have quite a few resources for survivors that are available in Spanish as well, in addition to the services that we provide in English. So that was quick. I crammed it in as fast as I could. So here we go.
Thank
y'all.
you so much, Crystal. That was unbelievable content and so useful and helpful. We did have, and I know that we are at the 3 o'clock mark if anybody needs to go, but we do, we at least THN staff and Crystal, if you're able to as well, we can stick around for a few more minutes. I know that we have one question. And Hope, I know you're kind of looking at, I know it is more targeted with coordinated entry. But
Yeah, I can go ahead and take that question. And if
Yeah.
other folks have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat.
for sure.
I see John has a question. Sounds like you're having some trouble making warm referrals to your local service or local victim service provider and are wanting some direction, and then also wanting to know if it's appropriate to refer clients outside of the county that they are initially accessing services in. So one, this is a great question. And thank you for asking, because I think this is probably relevant to or maybe relatable to other folks in the room as well. So a couple of things come to mind. One, I would say that making a warm referral and a warm handoff is a best practice, and we should do that as often as possible, but it's not a requirement necessarily. Again, like we should always strive to be able to offer that, but the inability to offer a warm referral shouldn't be a barrier to going ahead and making that referral for those services, regardless of the ability to make that referral. So if you're having challenges with being able to offer referral to your local service provider, for whatever the case might be, I think some things you could do in lieu of that would be providing as much information as you can to the client to help them better understand the agency and what to expect when accessing services, so they can prepare themselves both physically and mentally for what it might look like to give that organization a call, set up an appointment, or go and just show up at their front door and try to access services. In addition, I know that a lot of local or a lot of victim service providers require their clients to access services through their crisis line or their hotline as the first point of contact to be able to access any other services in their agency. So if that's the case for your specific victim service provider in your community, I think something that you could consider in lieu of that warm referral, if you're not able to make it, is go ahead and make that call to the crisis line with that client in your office, and sit with them, as they're receiving that information, as they're disclosing their experience, and then sitting with them after to help kind of validate and talk through that experience. And then again, ideally, or in theory, there's going to be some next steps that come out of that call, so that you can use that opportunity to kind of help them prepare for the next steps of going and accessing those services at your local victim service provider. So those are some initial things that come to mind. In terms of whether or not it's appropriate to refer folks to services outside of your county, I would say yes, it's absolutely appropriate if that's what your survivor that you're engaging with is wanting and needing and has the ability to access those services in another county. I think, it could depend on a number of factors. I know I live in an area where I'm really close to another county, so it wouldn't be a big deal for me to, cross county lines to be able to access services. So if transportation or finances or location isn't a barrier to that client and they want a referral to a provider outside of the county, then yes, absolutely do that. Again, I think a lot of Billy's content, a lot of Crystal's content were survivor-led processes. So if that's what the survivor is wanting, then we should, be flexible as service providers and offer those flexibilities as needed. And then I
Also
think,
good, just to add on, Hope, real quick, sorry to interrupt you. It's also a safety planning thing. Many people know where their DV center is in their organization. I've worked on cases where the person that's harming them volunteered at that center, or maybe they went for another organization to drop off Christmas presents and they could find the survivor. So an out-of-county option actually ended up being safer and better for that particular survivor in those cases. So sometimes you do have to get the survivor out of town for their safety. So.
Yeah, that is such a great insight, Crystal, and I'm just so glad you're here.
Yeah.
And the last thing I wanted to say is that, if you're a homeless service provider and you're routinely having challenges engaging with your local victim service provider, I would take that back to your local homeless coalition and talk about how, as a coalition, we can, or you can, strategically invite your victim service providers to be at the table and show up in a meaningful way, and then be prepared to meaningfully engage them in your coalition so that you can help foster those relationships locally.
Yeah, and just that idea too, Crystal, one of the best places that Crystal shared that just really, really resonated for me that I love is just we talk about as a COC leveraging healthcare and housing agencies and organizations, but just the idea of leveraging victim service providers as well. The idea of actually be able to create and foster a partnership and relationship where one day per week or something you have one of the advocates come to your office and and provide their services and just be available for this population in your participants. I think it's really goes a long way and is a really great advice. And I want to also make a plug real quick too. If as you're going through all of the resources and everything that Crystal has shared, a really good starting point too that we've seen this in our training and resources is the National Domestic Violence Hotline's interactive safety plan. It just really gives a simple way of kind of looking at all the different particular areas to focus on regarding safety, as well as just defining it and going through the process as well. So that's a very helpful resource too. But yeah, Crystal, is there anything else that you?
No, I think that's it. Yeah, feel free to reach out. Our contact info is in the chat box. So definitely follow up with us. So
Awesome. So we're going to be able to share this with all of you afterwards, the recording. I'll also share a PDF that has all of the links that you're seeing, but it also has links to our slide presentations, contact information, and the whole thing. And we'll be able to share that with you so that you can utilize these resources as you need in your organizations. So thank you so much for joining us today. If you have additional questions, you have the email address, send them our way, and we'll do our best to continue to support you as we can. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, y'all.
Good. Thanks, everyone.
Animal and why. So we love, if you haven't put that in the chat yet, we'd love to hear from you.